demonic angel. Today I'm going to talk about the Renaissance Italian philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli. Basically, I wrote a little, it's like a 2-page paper after I kind of briefly talked about that one quote of his pertaining to reading and how just like it's so vital, and it really takes you to a place of knowledge, and it's like you could communicate with it's in a very special way with the in most cases deceased people who have written such philosophies. So I thought, well, let's shine a spotlight on him. And so he's a Renaissance philosopher, and his most famous political work, he did have some other books published, but The Prince, it's really well known here in the United States. I actually had to read it, I think when I was maybe like a freshman in high school, like for a social science class. And it's written into different chapters, but it's about like how rulers should treat their subjects, basically, should they wish to succeed in being rulers, staying in power, staying alive, really. And it's a lot of oh gosh, how can I put it? There's a lot of violence, and it's basically what's really different about it. And of course, there's always this kind of point where philosophers and pop culture are misunderstood, just as Nietzsche, that this was from a moral point of view. Machiavelli was not saying that he advocates violence, that he advocates just brutality and things that seem really consciencelessness. He is saying that this is how people behave, and he lived for 1469 to 1527. So this is almost like, even though Machiavelli was, he spent his life in politics and actually as a military leader himself, he was talking about this from like a psychological point of view of observation, that, well, whether you like it or not, people are violent, people are cruel, and there's kind of this, as we know, this kind of mentality. Carl Jung would go on to call it the collective unconsciousness, but it works in smaller ways, such as egregores, where if you have somebody who is, let's take for example a leader of a political party, and the way they and their followers, there's a certain mentality that comes about with that, and it's not based on morality at all. It's more the psychology of people. So that's the one big thing when people kind of look at a surface level of The Prince, and it's certainly not meant to be looked at from a moral point of view. So Machiavelli was born to a fairly wealthy family, and they sent him to school, and he learned grammar, Latin, math, and one of the big things that's really interesting, it actually lasted in Western culture, talking about America and Europe really here, and it lasted well into, gosh, the 1950s. Really, I think that's probably when it died out. But that men in private schools, whatever, privileged men would learn rhetoric, and rhetoric is persuasive, the art of persuasive speech. So in college, most people have to take a public speaking class. this was like a big focus for men to consider. You form a point of view, right, based on some paper you're supposed to write. It doesn't matter whether you agree with it or not, and you pour your emotions, you pour your intellect in it, and you stand up there and you persuade people that you're right about your point of view, even if, like, you're not, even if you're not. And it's very, that is, why we have, for many reasons, women didn't learn to read and write as much as men, all these, kinds of reasons, but that's why we have men in Western philosophy being such deep, having so much to offer us, because they were schooled in the art of rhetoric, persuasive speech. So that's just kind of a little side trip, if you will. And politics, that's Machiavelli's thing. It's full of crime and deception, and that's just how people are. And one of the things that's really interesting is about 200 years before Machiavelli lived, Dante, the gentleman who wrote Dante's Inferno, which describes 7 different layers of hell, where, according to a different sin, people in hell suffer different punishments according to that sin. And it's very detailed, and it really captured the imaginations and beliefs of people of the Middle Ages. Like, this for them would be, if you do something wrong, this is how you're going to suffer. So it went from a pop culture to being incorporated into religion. But by the time Machiavelli comes around a couple hundred years ago, after that, in the 1400s, it's a really bad situation at the time, where Spain, Italy, and what's now called the Vatican, it used to be the Papal States, and they were just warring for control of different land. And of course, Machiavelli noticed that the Papal States would say, they get mercenaries and people from all over the place, because they say God's on our side, and we're going to claim this land for God, Christianity, and then they'd fucking kill people and torture them, because torture was very popular, as you probably know, during the Middle Ages, and just in the name of God. So this, Machiavelli, he was very critical of organized religion. When he did die, he did still have a priest administer his last rites to him, but I think that it's more like he saw that people are taking this, and not to use it for spirituality, but to use it for power, and that's what the prince is really all about. And so when he's growing up and in the private school kind of idea, there was military leaders. It's not just like, hey, you lost. People were just executing each other in very violent public ways, because the public executions, the point of that is to instill fear in people, obviously. And so he witnessed this from the time he was a young kid, which was very common. But he was so brilliant and so smart and everything that he was able to command a local militia, which for young gentlemen who come from wealthy families, they would take some kind of career as a diplomat, as a philosopher, advisor, something like that, where it's like they're not out in starving in the city. They're not out in the farmlands, but they're doing these very important urban jobs. And he commanded a militia. Now, what stands Machiavelli out right away from the other people, other gentlemen were organizing militias to protect Florence. This is where Machiavelli lived, and they were not successful when they would try to go get supplies, even just, you know, that being defensive. But he was, because he refused to employ mercenaries in his militia, and mercenaries are, you know, paid people, paid soldiers who come in and they're going to fight for you. So if you're from Germany, you come to Italy, now I'm going to pay for you to be my soldier, right? But Machiavelli thought, what that man does not, he's not going to, it's not in his blood, it's not personal to him to fight for my militia. This is a paycheck. And I'm not going to be successful. I need people to have this emotional, personal, invigorating connection. And it worked out for him. So a lot of other people were starting to back off on hiring mercenaries and hire locally. Because, and it makes sense, obviously, because you have this connection to your nationality, you have this connection to your land, and if it's going to be invaded or something, it's very easy to understand why you would feel personal about that. But after some time, he was imprisoned by the Medici family, Medici, I think, and they kept him for 3 weeks in prison, and they tortured him because they were fighting his militia for control of, I believe it's Florence, but what happened to him? This torture is called strappado, or reverse hanging, and it's where they would bound a person's arms or wrists behind their back and then hang them, you know, from like the ceiling. So then it's putting all the pressure of the body on the arms and the wrists. And sometimes they would just leave people hang like that till they died. And you know, they'd have, eventually you would have some blood pressure problems, and that would lead to a heart attack and death. But a lot of times they would do this, like with Machiavelli, where it's done in these short bursts, and it did dislocate his shoulders. So, you know, this physically impacted him, and obviously probably more so psychologically. But they released him because it was just, they disbanded his militia, and now he doesn't have any kind of power like that. So Machiavelli, he goes back to, it's basically his family farm estate where the family money and relations come from. And he became kind of reclusive. He was probably suffering from the dislocated shoulders and such. But he began to, one of the things he did was he would write plays, and they were actually popular while he was alive. They're very short plays, and they really have to actually just do with the classic stuff of drama or tragedy, and these were really popular. So he was able to, you know, see when he was alive, he saw this being successful, and he came into you know, the cities, and he watched some of his own plays, and he met with friends and everything, and you know, his concerns with as he aged, he talked about his concerns with organized religion, and one of the things he says is that it made men weak and inactive, delivering politics into the hands of cruel and wicked men without a fight. And I think that us modern people, we can really understand what religion, the bad things that religion has been used for. I'm talking about organized religion, and you don't have to look too far or be that old to understand that. So it's very true. It's still true today. So Machiavelli he's both a gentleman of his time, and of course his thoughts, his ideas, they're timeless. They're still relevant today. So that's really, I think, a beautiful thing about a great philosopher, is that they capture just that spirit, atmosphere of their time, and then what they say, 500 years later is still makes sense, and it's unfortunately still a problem, which is what philosophy tries to address. But I mean, they put their thoughts out there. We just have to listen. Yeah, so then I thought I'll fucking read some of his quotes that I thought were really interesting. And these are just some of the ones I like, because I think it gives a picture of some of his philosophy. That's the real idea. And one of the things he says is, the more sand has escaped from the hourglass of life, the clearer we should see through it. So that's basically, when we're young, and we think we're gonna, I can't imagine being old. These people, I'm better than them. I am beautiful. Just that kind of arrogance of youth, and that kind of, for most people, that goes away as we age. Because this, and the beauty of that is it's matching up with how life really is. We're not young forever and better than everybody else. We get a little bit humbled, and that's really a part of the beauty of the journey of life. The wise man does at once what the fool does finally. And that made me think of the fool in the tarot, of course. And sometimes it takes people a little bit longer. Sometimes it takes people many lives to understand that this is part of themselves. But people, a humble, open kind of person can take something and learn right away, and then apply that change a lot faster, rather than wait many lifetimes. Hence it comes about that all armed prophets have been victorious, and all unarmed prophets have been destroyed. Boy, does that one make sense, and you don't have to think deeply about that. So, you're talking about how you are the God's chosen prophet or whatever, right? But you want to make sure that you have guns, right? That it's not a coincidence that whatever, a schizophrenic or religious person who doesn't have any resources, doesn't have charisma, and most importantly doesn't have arms, they're not going to really, they're not going to be able to inspire too much fear. And fear is a great way, as Machiavelli knows and talks about, to convince people to at least not cross you. They might not agree with you, but you're going to probably be safe. You're more likely to be safe and not attacked. Here, where the willingness is great, the difficulties cannot be great. That makes me think of Nietzsche. And I love thinking about how, Nietzsche comes right before Freud and eventually Jung. And the inspiration that goes back, you could see how these people are reading each other's stuff and learning off of that. And I certainly don't know if Nietzsche read Machiavelli, but Machiavelli's quote, Nietzsche talking about that suffering is like the ultimate, you find meaning in the suffering. That's what Machiavelli's saying in slightly different words. Never was anything great achieved without danger, obviously. Men are so simple and so much inclined to obey immediate needs that a deceiver will never lack victims for his deceptions, which is very true. People who are stressed, vulnerable, but more specifically, people who are looking for a part of their own identity outside of themselves, they're going to find it in convincing people. And a lot of these times, all these quacks we know about in history, they certainly didn't believe in their own bullshit, but they sold it, and they sold it really well, because people, especially especially a large part of the masses, are looking for identity outside of themselves, and so it's not hard to convince them to buy a vacuum cleaner for $300 at the door, you know. So then I'll just end this by, you know, reading my favorite quote from Machiavelli, and this is it. When evening comes, I go back home and I go to my study. On the threshold, I take off my work clothes, covered in mud and filth, and I put on the clothes an ambassador would wear. Decently dressed, I enter the ancient courts of rulers who have long since died. There I am, warmly welcomed, and I feed on the only food I find nourishing and was born to savor. I am not ashamed to talk to them and ask them to explain their actions, and they, out of kindness, answer me. 4 hours go by without my feeling any anxiety. I forget every worry. I am no longer afraid of poverty or frightened of death. I lived entirely through them. That's honestly, it's my favorite quote of all time. My grandfather, my biological grandfather, had not too long before I read The Prince, so probably about 8th grade, I had actually spent some time with him. Of course, at the time I didn't know he was my biological grandfather, but he told me, you know, he was a great storyteller, and he just told me, you just keep reading, and if you read something, dig deeper, keep looking. Don't just read the one thing about something, just keep reading. And I did. It just, as a young child, it's just stuck. That was that moment that transformed me. And so when I was reading The Prince about Machiavelli, I actually went to the library before, well, you know, the internet was around, but it was like dial-up and such. And I just read actual books. I checked these actual books out on Machiavelli, and I read about him as a person. And when that was happening, I read that one quote, and I kept it forever. That's why I just, I'll read dictionary sometimes, like if I just want, or I like to read a lot of biology, but I just keep that hunger, you know, and really going in, and it really is. For me personally, I do actually. I like to. Sometimes it's at night. Sometimes it's not. Whatever, but I like to come out and I just read. I don't want to, I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to be around anybody or distracted, and I just engage in whatever comes to my mind. I could start off being interested in biology and end up looking up a specific doctor's life because it's fascinating. But that's really a big treat for me, indulging in that kind of alone time and engaging in that way. And I've always thought of it like that I'm really connecting with the people who, in this case with philosophy, they had these kinds of revelations, and it's just it's very deep for me. So anyway, I hope you all enjoyed my presentation on Machiavelli, and I'll talk to you later.